Hi, I'm Chelsea of Friday Pattern Company, and this week we are doing the Patina Blouse sew along. So if you missed it last week, we did a little intro video that kind of breaks down the details about the patina as well as some fit stuff, and then this week we're going to sew it. So we'll take you step by step through the process of making it. To follow the sew along, you're going to want to have your pattern printed and your pieces cut out, and then we will do the actual sewing. The fabric we're using for this sew along is a cotton voile from Blackbird Fabrics, and I will link it if it is still available. It's a little bit dark, and on camera it's kind of hard to see what's going on, so I'm going to do my best to really describe it, and hopefully you'll be able to see it well enough. But I thought that it was gonna film a little bit lighter, but yeah, so it should still be good. Yeah, so let's get into it.
The first thing we're going to do is stay stitch the necklines on our front piece and our back yoke. So you do that by sewing 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the raw fabric on the curved neckline. And this keeps the neckline from stretching out as we sew, because we're not going to finish it right away, and we don't want the neckline to be distorted, because then when we sew in our collar, it won't fit. So you'll just take it over to your sewing machine and sew 1/4 of an inch from the edge on both front pieces and your back yoke neckline. Next, we're going to snip in at all of our notches, and you could have actually done this while you were cutting your pieces out, but that's just a little snip with scissors at each of these little lines, and you'll just snip in 1/4 of an inch. Those are reference points that you'll use when sewing to help you match things up. The next thing we're going to do is mark our dart legs on the wrong side of our front piece A. And this fabric is really hard to tell the difference on camera from right side and wrong side, but this is the wrong side facing up. So you're going to cut up one of the dart legs, and then you can just fold it, and that'll kind of give you your whole triangle. And then you can lay that out on your piece, and then just use I use this Choco liner to mark your dart, and you'll repeat that on both sides. We have several pieces that need to have interfacing fused onto them, first of which is collar piece E. You should have cut 4 of these, 2 pairs. So you're going to grab 1 pair that will be interfaced, and this is the side that will be facing up on your final top. So just if that matters with like what pattern is showing, just keep that in mind. So I lay this wrong side facing up, and the interfacing goes gluey side down, and then you can just fuse that on following the instructions for the interfacing that you bought. Sometimes you'll need like a pressing cloth here, but mine's fine to just press right on top of. You'll repeat that with 2 of your collar pieces, and then we will fuse our interfacing piece onto the wrong side of your facing F piece, and that lines up so the squared bottom matches up with the squared bottom of your facing, and then this angled side matches up close to the neckline of the facing, and you'll just fuse that in place on the wrong side of your fabric for both of your facing pieces. Finally, if you are making the long sleeve version, you're going to fuse interfacing onto the wrong side of your cuff piece. You'll use your cuff interfacing piece, and you just align this with the top of your cuff, and you're going to repeat that for both cuff pieces. This next step is also only if you're making the long sleeve version, but you are going to mark the buttonhole placement on the right side of your cuff piece, and you're going to do it on the upper half, the interfaced portion of your cuff. So the way I do that is just place the piece over it and then fold it down so that I can see where the buttonhole sits, and then I can use my Choco liner to just transfer the buttonhole mark. The last bit of prep that we're going to do, and again it's only if you're making the long sleeve version, is that we are going to cut up the slash mark at the hem of our sleeve for our placket. So I have both of my sleeves here, and I'm just overlaying the pattern piece, and I'm just going to cut right up this line that is marked at the hem. All right, it's time to start sewing, and we are going to start by assembling the collar. So just remember that the seam allowance throughout this pattern is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter unless it's otherwise specified. So we'll put our two interfaced collar pieces right sides together, and we're just going to sew up this little short end. And then after you sew that, you can press that seam open and repeat this on the other set of collars, the uninterfaced set of collar E's. Now we join our interfaced and uninterfaced collars together. So I'm just going to lay them out right sides together on top of each other. And then we're going to stitch all the way around the outer edge of our collars. So the short angled seam at the bottom and then up all the way around the hill and on the short edge on the other side. And you'll use your 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have those sewn together, we're going to go in and we're going to trim down the seam allowance. And then we will clip in at the corners, just that clip very close to the seam at that corner, and then trim down all the way around. You can notch the curves if you want, just to get this as ready as possible to flip and press and get like a really crispy point right there. After all of our trimming and clipping, we are going to bring our collar over to our iron and just flip it right side out and give it a good press to get it looking nice and neat. You can use something to gently poke out the corners of the collar just to get a really crispy point there. And then we will take this over to our sewing machine to baste these two layers together. We're going to baste our two layers of collar together around the neckline just to hold them in place and keep them a little neater for when we attach it to the shirt. Everything stays tidy and easy to sew. Okay, my apologies, but step 4 and 5 did not get filmed, even though I thought they were being filmed. So basically what you're going to do is right sides together, you're going to sew your two facing pieces together along that short back seam, and then you'll press that seam open, and then you'll use a long straight stitch to sew a guide all the way around the outside of the facing using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. This stitch that you can see here is a guide for pressing under in this step that we're now moving on to, step 6. So you've got your facing all set up with your guide stitch on it, and then you're going to clip in like where the neckline changes to the front of the top, and then you can clip around the curve if you want, and then we will just very neatly press this under 3/8 of an inch all the way around using the stitch as a guide. We're going to set aside the facing and the collar for now and move on to the body of the top. So here is our front piece A, and we are going to sew up the dart. This is the wrong side of the fabric that you're looking at right now. I know it's hard to tell, and we have our dart marked on here. So I put a pin at the point of the dart, and then I'm just matching up the legs and adding in another pin so that I know I have these legs matched up perfectly. Then I'll take it over to the sewing machine and carefully sew up our marked dart leg. And when you get to the end, you can get as close as you can to the edge of the fabric and take a couple stitches and then sew off the fabric and sew a few more stitches, and it will twist the thread so that it doesn't come undone. I've never had a problem with this. Some people like to backstitch or like turn around and stitch back onto their dart, or even tie off the threads at the end of their dart. It's up to you, but you will repeat this on both front piece A's. After that, you can press your dart downward and admire your handiwork. Now we're going to join our back yoke B to our front pieces at the shoulder seam. You have two back yoke pieces. So the one that you want to be showing on the outside will be this one that you're laying down. I've got that facing right side up, and then I am placing my front piece A's right side down so that the right sides match. And we're just matching up the shoulder seam, and we will stitch that using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you're going to repeat that on both sides. And now you're going to grab your other back yoke piece and you will lay it so that it is right sides together with the other back yoke, and your front pieces are going to be sandwiched in the middle. You'll match up those shoulder seams, and then you are going to sew this using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. This is going to give us a really nice finish on our shoulders because we won't have any visible seams, and that'll all be tucked in and finished for us beautifully. Before we press our yokes away from the body of our top, we are going to trim and grade this shoulder seam. You do this when there's more than 2 layers of fabric in a seam to reduce bulk. And you do that by cutting the different layers to different lengths. So I'm cutting this first layer down to a 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to cut this other layer down to 1/8 of an inch, and it creates stairs, kind of, so that it lays flatter when it's all pressed. And you'll repeat this on both shoulders. Now you can go over to your iron, and then you'll just pull your yokes up away from your front piece and give those shoulders a nice press. Grab your back C, and we are going to add gathering stitches to the top. So you have these 2 notches up here, and you're going to add 2 rows of gathering stitches there. To do a gathering stitch, you want to lengthen the stitch to 3.5 to 5 millimeters long, and you'll sew your first row a 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric between the 2 notches, and then you're going to sew another row of stitches a 1/4 inch parallel to that stitch. Okay, so now we're going to attach this back piece to our back yoke. You'll lay your project out with right side facing up, and we're only going to pin the back to 1 layer of yoke because there's 2 yokes down there. So just the outer one that is facing up when you have your project laying out right side facing up. So separate those, and then you can pin right sides together, pin your back piece to the back yoke matching the notches, and you'll have some extra space in between the notches and where your gathering stitches are, and you'll pull in on your gathering stitches until the length of that back seam matches the size of your back yoke. Once you have your gathers distributed how you want them and everything's pinned in place, you can sew these together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to finish this back seam by joining the 2 yokes together. How we do that is we lay our project out right side up, and it helps to kind of really lay this out flat so you can see everything. And then you'll roll the back up so that it sits on top of the yoke. And then you're going to roll your front pieces up so that they also kind of are sitting on top of that back yoke. And this will make it so that you can pull the back yoke that is not sewn to your back piece around your project. So you have this unattached back yoke piece that can now pull around, and it'll match up with the back yoke piece that you had sewn to your back already. And you'll be able to match those right sides together and match the notches, and then you will sew those using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. When you sew this seam, you're going to be sewing through 2 back yoke pieces, and then you'll have your back piece sandwiched in the middle. So 3 layers of fabric. Again, you'll use your 3/8 inch seam allowance here, and you're just going to want to push any bit of your project that's maybe gotten up close in there out of the way so that it doesn't get sewn when you do the stitch. So here we are sewing this at the sewing machine, and again, just being careful that no pieces have gotten bunched up in there, because you've got a lot of fabric rolled inside of your yokes, and you just want to make sure to squish it out of the way so that you only sew through those 3 layers of fabric. Here's what your project should look like at this point, and we can just pull it right side out by pulling the front and the back pieces through the sides of the yoke, and it will just magically pull out, and then you'll have a beautiful finished seam along the back, and the shoulders are fully encased. Now we join the collar to our top. You'll lay your top out right side facing up, and then you can just place your collar right on top. The collar, the end of the collar matches up with a notch on your top. So you'll just match that up, and then you can also match there's a second notch that matches up with the shoulder seam, and then you're going to want to match the seam where your collars are joined at center back will match up with a notch that is at center back. Once you have it all lined up nicely, you can take it to your sewing machine and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew all the way around. And here's what that looks like sewn. Now our facing comes into play. So lay your blouse out right side facing up, and we are going to pin the facing around the front of the top and the neckline. Making sure you're pinning these right sides together, you can start at the center back where there is a seam on your facing that matches up with the center back seam on your collar. And then you also have the same notches that were on your collar that match up with the shoulder seam, and then also the seam that is at the center front, and then your facing also gets pinned all the way down the front of your top. Once you have this all pinned in place, you'll take this over to the sewing machine and use a 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew all the way around. Here I have that sewn up, and now we are going to understitch our seam allowance to the facing of the blouse, just up the front, not around the neckline. So you do that by pushing the seam allowance towards the facing, away from the blouse, and you're just going to sew 1/8 inch from that seam, and you'll sew up towards the neckline of the blouse, and you'll stop when you get to where it wants to like curve away. This will just hold the seam allowance under so that it doesn't roll forward on the front of your blouse. And you'll repeat that on both sides. Now we're going to flip our facing around to the wrong side of the blouse, but first we need to do a little bit of clipping and trimming. So you're going to clip the curve around the neckline by just clipping into the seam allowance without clipping through it. And you'll just trim those corners, and then you'll be able to flip the facing around and we'll give it a nice press. So I like to start by pressing up the center fronts of the top and then just working my way around the neckline. Now we are going to very carefully pin the facing in place all the way around so that we can edge stitch it to secure it. And we pressed that edge under earlier in the process when we sewed the guide, and then we pressed it under, and that is helping us out now so that we have this nice pressed edge, and all we need to do is use a bunch of pins to pin it neatly in place. And you do kind of have to lay your project out flat here to get the curve going around the neckline so that it can be pinned flat. You'll pin all the way around the neckline and then down the fronts, and then we'll be ready to secure this facing in place. Now we're going to secure the facing in place by edge stitching it down all the way around. So that folded edge that we just pinned in place, we are going to sew 1/8 of an inch from that, going all the way around. I realized literally as I was sewing this that this would be a great opportunity to add a little handmade tag that I have from Stone Mountain and Daughter Fabric. If you have any tags like this is a great step to add it in. So I literally pulled it off my machine, pulled out a pin, and I'm pinning this in at that center back seam that's on our facing. I'm just sticking this right underneath and then pinning it in place. And then I stuck it back under the machine and continued to edge stitch all the way around the neckline. This next step is only applicable if you're making the long sleeve version, but you're going to grab your placket binding piece H, and you are going to press the long edges on it under 1/4 of an inch. So that's towards the wrong side. You're going to press them under 1/4 of an inch. And we are going to start to assemble our continuous bound placket. So grab your sleeve that should have the mark cut open at the hem that we did during the prep phase, and you are going to pin your placket to that opening. The binding and the sleeve get sewn together right sides together, and you have those edges of your binding pressed under 1/4 of an inch, and that's going to be a guide for you in these next couple steps. Right sides together, we're going to pin the placket binding to this opening on our sleeve, and we are going to match up the ends with the ends of the opening. But as we go towards the top of the slash mark, that point, that is actually going to meet up with the 1/4 inch kind of pressed edge that we have on our placket binding. And it'll just overlap that pressed edge by just a couple of tiny threads. And then you'll pin down the other side the same way that you pinned up that first side. So here that is pinned, and we're going to take this over to the sewing machine, and we use a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, following the edge of the placket binding, not the sleeve. Here we are at the sewing machine, and again, we've got these right sides together. You want to sew it with the sleeve facing up, and you're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance following the edge of the placket binding. When you get to the center where the point of that slash mark is, you're only going to catch just a couple threads and then keep sewing down following the edge of the binding. Be careful here not to kind of create a pleat. It may seem like you have, but it's actually more forgiving than it seems like it would be. Now we're going to encase that seam that we just made by folding the binding around that seam allowance, and it's just going to barely overlap that seam that we just made, and we'll pin it nicely in place. And then we are going to edge stitch this carefully in place. You just want to be careful at that point to make sure that you don't create any pleats. Here is what that looks like sewn, and the hardest part is over. Now we just need to do a couple of things to secure this in place. You're going to make sure that the placket is going towards the wrong side of your sleeve, and you're just going to pinch it right at that point. And we'll sew a little diagonal seam right there to kind of hold the placket shut. And you're going to back stitch at the beginning and the end of that stitch. This seam is going to hold the placket in place, but you're only sewing on the placket in this step. You're not sewing on the seam at all. So just a little diagonal seam right here, and you're going to back stitch, and you'll repeat this on both sleeves. The last thing we're going to do for our placket is just a little basting stitch. You're going to have your placket towards the wrong side of your sleeve, and then you are going to baste this side of it that's on the wider part of your sleeve down, so that when we sew on the cuff, it doesn't accidentally get flipped outward. So you're just going to do a little basting stitch to hold that in place, just on the one side of the placket. And here is our continuous bound placket in all of its glory. You can see we've got that little bottom part basted in place, and the diagonal seam, which doesn't go through the sleeve, is just going to hold your placket really nicely, and the finish is so nice from the front because you almost can't even see it. Now that we have the plackets done, we will move on to preparing the sleeve to be joined to the body of the blouse. So we're going to add gathering stitches along the cap of the sleeve. You have a single notch and a double notch at the top of your sleeve, and you are going to add gathering stitches to the top there, and this is similar to what you did earlier to your back C piece. So you'll use a long stitch, sew one row of stitches, and then sew another row of stitches a 1/4 inch from that one, and you'll repeat that on both sleeves. The sleeve gets pinned right sides together with the body of the blouse and it's sewn in flat. So here I am just laying my blouse out right side facing up, and then you can go ahead and grab your sleeve and pin that in, matching up. The single notch matches up with the single notch on the front, and then the double notch straddles that yoke seam on the back. So where you have two little notches, that will straddle that yoke seam, and then the ends of the sleeve match up, obviously. And then you'll have extra sleeve along the cap where you have your gathering stitches, and we will just pull on those gathering stitches to gather it in until it matches the length of the sleeve cap. And I like to concentrate my gathers up towards the shoulder point, but you can, some people like to spread them out more along the cap. It's up to you. Once you have everything all pinned in place and your gathers distributed neatly, you can take this over to the sewing machine and use a 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew it in flat. Here I have both of the seams sewn on, and can you believe that we've made it this far without having to finish a single seam? Well, that changed here. So you have to finish these shoulder seams and press them towards the body. Once you have that done, you can flip it inside out so that you've got your right sides together, and we are going to match up our sleeve underarm and our side seam, and we're going to sew this all in one go. So you'll start by matching up your sleeve hem, and you can throw a pin in there, and then you'll pin all the way up the underarm, matching the underarm seams with each other, and make sure that they are facing towards the body of your blouse. And then you can pin down the side seam, and you'll take this to the machine and you'll use a 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew all the way down the underarm pivot and then sew down the side seam. And then you're going to repeat that on both sides, and then you will finish these seams using your preferred finishing method. I'm using a serger here. You could do a zigzag stitch, whatever feels right to you. Here's that finished. You can see that we have those underarm and side seams serged, and we'll move on to assembling the sleeve cuff. First, we need to add gathering stitches to the hem of the sleeve. So just like you did with the back C when you added those gathering stitches before you attached it to the yoke, just do that to the sleeve hems and you'll repeat on both sides. Now you're going to grab your cuff piece, which should have interfacing on it from the beginning, and the first thing we're going to do is press this uninterfaced upper edge under 3/8 of an inch. Then you're going to fold the cuff down at the notches on the short ends of your cuff, and we are going to prepare this to sew at our sewing machine. You'll sew down these short sides while keeping that 3/8 of an inch still pressed under, and you'll do that on both sides of each cuff and repeat on both cuffs. Here's that sewn, and you can see I still have that folded under edge preserved, and we're just going to flip this right side out by pinching this corner and then pushing it through, and you'll get a nice little sharp corner right there. If you don't get a perfectly sharp corner, you can always just poke it gently with something, and then you can give this a nice press. Next up, you're going to grab your cuff and your sleeve, and you're going to pin them together, right sides together around the hem. Now we have those gathering stitches around the hem of our sleeve, and those will be pulled in so that the sleeve hem opening matches the size of the cuff. You're going to pin them right sides together, matching up this unpressed edge of your sleeve cuff with the opening of your placket and going around the hem. I like to bring the cuff out just a tiny bit, like a thread's width, past the end of the placket end, so that when we fold this around our sleeve hem, it'll get a really nice finish. So you'll just add in some clips and make sure the gathers are distributed evenly, and then you can take this over to your sewing machine and sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Here that is sewn up, and now we are going to tuck the sleeve back into the cuff. So we'll do that by pulling the cuff upward, and then that seam allowance just tucks inside, and then we're going to pin it carefully in place. We do this by gently pulling that pre-pressed folded edge down over the seam that we made in the last step. And then we're going to get that pinned nicely, and then we'll edge stitch along the bottom of the cuff. And here is our beautiful finished cuff. You're going to repeat that on both sides. Moving on to the hem of the blouse, we are going to sew a seam 3/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around the hem of the top. Here I have that done, and then we're just going to press the hem into place. You have that seam that you just sewed as a guide to press under 3/8 of an inch all the way around the hem. And then after you have that pressed nicely, you'll press it under another 3/8 of an inch and pin, or in my case, clip everything in place nicely. And then we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and we will edge stitch around the hem to finish it. You do that by just sewing 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge that we've created. And here is our beautiful finished hem. All that's left is to add our buttons and buttonholes. So your pattern came with little circle marks where the button and buttonholes are placed, and then a little guide on how to turn those circles into the buttonhole mark on your preferred side. So the buttonholes do go vertical, but you can put them on either the right or left depending on your preference. So here's the circle mark, and then I'm just going to take my guide and fold it down so that I'm able to match the circle up with that circle on the guide, and then I'll draw the full buttonhole mark on so that I know when I'm sewing where to place those. And then you'll just follow your sewing machine's instructions to sew the buttonholes and the buttons on. Here is the finished blouse in all of its glory. I'm so happy with how it turned out. The cotton voile is a lightweight fabric, but it has a crispness to it that I think gives the top still like it has some body, and I love how it looks. I'm so excited to layer this under a blazer or pair it with a jeans or a skirt or under a dress. It's very versatile. Anyway, I hope this sew along was helpful for you, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and yeah, we'll see you next time.